Welcome to the Synoptic Gospel Overview of the Gospel Series. This 9-part series will explore the history and development of the 4 Gospel accounts that open the New Testament and discuss a better way to understand the complete Gospel story of the teaching life and healing ministry of Jesus Christ. Part 1. The Gospel Record. As we know, Jesus, called the Christ, which is from the Greek word Christos for the Hebrew word Mashiach or Messiah, walked the earth and gave his teachings about God and salvation and the kingdom of heaven some 2,000 years ago. As it is believed that Jesus lived so long ago, how can we really know anything about him? The only way that anything can be known about Jesus, or what he said, or did, or taught, is through anything that he himself may have written, or that other people may have written about him, and that has survived for the past 2,000 years until the present time. Now, while there are a few historical records left from historians, such as the Jewish Josephus and a handful of others, the main record of the life and ministry of Jesus Christ can be found written in what are called Gospels. Gospels are written accounts of the things that Jesus reportedly said and did. The English word gospel is the Old English word for the Greek word euangelon, and it means God spell or God term, or most commonly in English today as good news. People like to think of the message of salvation that Jesus Christ taught about God and the kingdom of heaven as good news. And compared to the strict laws that formed the first covenant between God and the Israelite people, with its legal system of tithing and priests that was required to provide a continual burning sacrifice of animals for the sins of the people, the simple message of faith, love, and forgiveness brought by Jesus was very good news indeed. So a gospel is a written account of the life of Jesus that tells something about his life and ministry, such as his sayings and teachings, along with his mighty deeds and powerful miracles. Now here's a question. Did Jesus himself write anything? Did Jesus leave us a scroll or a book or some other record written by himself with his own hand? The answer is no, that it does not appear that Jesus wrote anything with his own hand, or at least nothing that has been found. Next question. Could Jesus even read and write? Any guesses? The answer is yes. Jesus could read and write, as it is recorded that he stood up to read from the scroll of Isaiah in the Nazareth synagogue on the Sabbath, and he wrote something on the ground in the courtyard of the temple in Jerusalem when the people wanted to stone the woman who had just been caught committing the act of adultery. However, it appears that as nothing has survived of anything that Jesus himself may have written, what we do have today are the writings of other people who wrote about Jesus and recorded his teachings. Although some of these writers may have been witnesses of the things about which they wrote, it appears that certainly all except possibly 2 of the 4 gospel accounts were written by those who were not first-hand eyewitnesses, and they had not ever met or been with Jesus. They were likely men who had heard the sayings and stories after they had been spread orally, by being told from one person to another as news. And that is what news is, some new event or happening. And so great was the story of the life of Jesus as the Messiah, the Christ, the Anointed One, that this news is called the Good News, which means gospel. Now today, we cannot imagine that oral accounts of stories and sayings of someone could be remembered and conveyed accurately and without error or embellishment over long decades, and perhaps we picture a big game of telephone gone wrong. But it should be remembered that back then, most people could not read or write, and our memories were much more attuned to accurately remember spoken words, because they had to be, even as they are in cultures today that do not have a formal system of writing. For our busy modern minds that process so much data every moment, and the confusion of all that information, it is perhaps hard to imagine that any detail from a story could be accurately conveyed at all. With this in mind, it appears that many decades after his death, the sayings of Jesus Christ and some of the stories from his life and ministry that were being told as Christianity had spread throughout the Roman Empire started to be written down in collections of writings that are known as Gospels. And despite the fact that Jesus commanded the apostles to go and preach the gospel, there are now many more than one single gospel account of the life and teachings of Jesus. Does anyone know how many Gospels there are? Well, the usual answer is that there are 4 gospel accounts that were written about the life and teachings of Jesus Christ. In particular, the 4 that are the first 4 books of the New Testament, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But in fact, it appears that there were certainly many more than just 20, possibly as many as 30 written accounts of the life of Jesus Christ and collections of his sayings. While we today have copies and fragments of many of these other Gospels, the existence is known of even more because they are referenced in the writings of the early Christian theologians and church fathers. Many of these Gospel-type accounts were named after or attributed to an important figure from the life of Jesus. So, in addition to the 4 familiar Gospel accounts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that we find as the opening books of the New Testament, there is also a Gospel of Thomas, which is a collection of the sayings of Jesus, as well as a Gospel of Peter, a Gospel of Philip, of Mary, and yes, even a Gospel of Judas, as well as the Gospel of the Apostles, the Gospel of the 12, of the Hebrews, and the Nazarenes, as well as the Gospel of the Truth, and others, and so on. So, the total number of such written accounts about Jesus that may have once existed is unknown, and apart from the 4 that are found in the opening of the New Testament of every Bible, all of these other written accounts and collections of stories were rejected by the early Roman Church, although some have continued to be used within the Eastern and Byzantine Church. Some of the rejected writings were banned, and most were burned. However, it is still possible that a copy or a fragment of those that are still hidden and lost may yet be found. All of these accounts about the life and teachings of Jesus were written down long after Jesus had left the earth and returned to heaven, and some of them were produced more than 100 or 200 years after his death and ascension. Whenever these accounts were written, each of them was written by someone with a particular interest and focus, and each was written to satisfy the interests and needs of a different audience. There was a purpose and reason why each author chose to write his version of the events from the life of Jesus. Now, while the subject of all the other Gospels is very interesting, and some of them are worth reading, our focus is on the 4 Gospels that we find in the New Testament of every Bible. This ends Part 1 of the Synoptic Gospel overview of the Gospels. Next, in Part 2, we will examine the 4 Gospels of the New Testament in some detail.